The fastest growing group of farmers in the U.S. is farmers over 65 years old. If you ask an older farmer when they plan to retire, they're likely to tell you maybe later.
Farmers are farmers. That's like retiring from who you are.
But older farmers also know they have something other people want, their land.
When I look overhead, I see a lot of vultures circling and descending on me. They can't wait until I retire.
Land is something a lot of people would like to have, but only a handful can afford.
Without a parent or a child or someone to help get going, it's really difficult to jump into this.
But even when a young farmer is waiting in the wings, many families don't plan for how they'll pass the farm to the next generation.
It's gonna be kind of fly by our seat of our pants, I think.
Often there's no one to take over. We see more big farms competing for land that used to be part of disappearing mid-sized farms. And we see small specialty farms gaining ground.
If this is really what you want to do, then do it.
By some estimates, more than half of the farmland in the U.S. could change hands over the next generation, moving the agriculture industry toward a time that could reshape the rural economy. Thousands of farm families will face a choice. Should they buy, sell, or hold? We examine that decision in Changing Lands, Changing Hands. This is a unique time to own farmland. Land prices have been rising at astonishing rates. Look at Nebraska, where the average acre of land is worth $2,600 per acre, double just 4 years earlier. Or Iowa, where land values have tripled within a decade. One farm even sold for $21,000 per acre. What's going on? Ryan Robertson found it starts with supply and demand.
It's one of the most exciting times in a farmer's life, buying land. It usually means their operation is expanding. At this land auction in Minden, Nebraska, close to 100 farmers are here to bid on 5 tracts of land. The sale attracts so many because the amount of farmland is limited. The United States has more arable land than any other nation on Earth, making up about 40% of the U.S. land base. Most of that is in the Midwest, but every state has some. More often than not, families pass farmland from one generation to the next. Sam Fogelsong and his family are the ones selling their land, which they've owned for generations. That's what makes this day so hard.
My grandfather, as I was growing up, always would say, that's something you don't want to do. I mean, it's the lands and investments you don't ever want to give up.
Your great-grandfather.
Fogelsong's great-grandfather, Anton Thompson, purchased the first acres under the Homestead Act of 1887. Through other purchases and marriage, the farm eventually grew to 687 acres. Fogelsong's mother, Marlene, an only child, inherited the farm and has been leasing it for the past 40 years. At her death, the land was passed down to Fogelsong and his 3 nieces. Since then, he and his family have been what experts call non-farmer operators, meaning they lease the land to others to farm. Ag economist Bruce Johnson has been researching land ownership for the past 40 years. He says non-operators are quite common.
Well, ownership of land does vary quite a bit across the country, but in the central part of the country, even up through the Corn Belt, Ohio Valley, and so forth, you see more than half the land owned by non-farmer operators. The people that have inherited the land a generation or two before and still own it.
Fogelsong's own health prompted him to make a decision about the future of his family's land. He was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder and pays $10,000 a month for treatment. With mounting medical bills and a lack of farmers in the family, he and his nieces decided their best option was to sell the family's land. Fogelsong knows his mother would be okay with the decision. She gave him her blessing before she died. And now, his own children will benefit from the land his great-grandfather bought more than a century ago.
knowing that this was what would be best for our family, I know that it would make her so happy. And knowing what we're going to be able to do with what we've gotten from the land now, like investing in my college education, my brothers, that was just, she'd be floored.
From a financial perspective, Fogelsong picked a good time to sell. Just one tract of irrigated cropland sold for $10,600 an acre. That's triple what it would have gone for just 2 years ago.
Prices have been on an increase now for several years, and so we're kind of becoming accustomed to land bringing more today than it did 6 months ago. And we're still in that uptrend at this point. Land is bringing more as we go along here.
Historically, only about 3% of U.S. farmland changes hands in a given year. In recent years, however, only about 1.5% of farmland has been sold.
Anybody give 98.50? 98.50.
The Fogelsong's land was bought by 3 established farm families, following a national trend of what experts call the disappearing middle of American agriculture.
Well, that's a trend that's been going on for a long time, that the fewer become larger and the majority phase out. And there is a disappearing middle. There's no question about it. And that probably will be a pattern that continues.
Even as he contributes to that disappearing middle, Sam Fogelsong knows the land will be in good hands. He's got it in writing from one of the buyers.
He actually sent me a letter just last week. Just told me that he would take really good care of the land and would honor that our family with it as much as he could, and so which was pretty cool. You know, he didn't have to do that and such, but I think there's almost a brotherhood or a code amongst farmers, you know, that passing one to another, they just, you know, he wanted to know it was in good hands.
Another pattern that's emerged over recent decades is the rising age of farmers. The average farmer is 57 years old, according to the USDA, and a growing share are past retirement age. These are farmers who've worked hard their whole lives and are finally making some good money. They're more likely to own the land they farm, and although time is working against them, they're in no hurry to give it up.
The farm was first purchased by my great-grandfather. He farmed it, his son farmed it after him, then my dad, and then me. I'm kind of the last guy on the chain.
Bob Hawthorne farms 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans in the Luss Hills of western Iowa. He's been doing it 60 years, and at the age of 84, he has no plans to slow down. It runs in the family. His father, Fred Hawthorne, stayed active on the farm into his 90s and lived to be 98, so Bob feels like he's still got plenty of time left to work.
I'd be bored not having anything to do. Now, I've also noticed that farmers, when they retire, buy a house in town, move into town, they die of a heart attack about the next year. Seems like farmers have to keep going, active, or they just fade away.
Hawthorne is part of a growing group of farmers. In fact, farmers over 65 years old have been the fastest growing group of farmers in the country. Working beyond retirement is a national trend. In 2012, 5% of the U.S. workforce was old enough to retire, but a quarter of all farm operators were over 65. When it comes down to it, it's just easier for farmers to work longer.
It's not quite as backbreaking a task as it used to be. Well, it isn't. It's more you use your mind rather than your back, so you can go longer.
And thanks to higher yields at today's high grain prices, farming is more lucrative now than just about any time since Bob Hawthorne came back to the farm in 1955. But in surveys of Iowa farmers, Mike Duffy has learned regardless of the money or new technology, some farmers will just never quit.
Farmers are farmers, and that's who they are, and that's who they identify themselves as, and so they don't, that's like retiring from who you are. They'll leave horizontal, and that's just, that's who farmers are.
I think what keeps older farmers going is the fear that if I don't keep going, there's nothing left for me to make me feel like I'm contributing and am a valuable person. that keeps a lot of farmers continuing, even perhaps when their bodies say we should quit this.
Psychologist Mike Roseman calls it the agrarian imperative. It's something he knows personally as a retired farmer himself. It's the kind of determination to keep farming that causes Bob Hawthorne to push back when neighbors ask about retirement.
They keep bugging me and say, "Oh, when are you going to quit?" I think I'll tell them I won't quit farming until all hell freezes over, or something like that.
But even as farmers take the long view on their careers, there may be some things they don't see coming.
We know the incidences of injuries and occupation-related illnesses is higher for agriculture than almost any other occupation. Aging farmers are losing their friends. Sometimes they're losing health, and they're more prone to depression and even in some cases suicide, from what we know from the data.
Decide if that's where they want to go. And
access to care is a problem in many rural areas. The Nebraska Rural Response Hotline has been helping farmers and their families find counseling since the farm crisis of the 1980s. But many don't get the help they need. Studies have found the risk of suicide is 60% higher for farmers than the rest of the population. Studies also show a surprising number of farmers work late into their careers without a plan for how it will eventually end.
Over half of aging farmers don't have a will or an estate plan, and I think it reflects what you and I are discussing, and that is perhaps a denial of the fact that somebody's got to take over and I need to have a plan for that.
The plans older farmers make have larger implications because more often than not, they own the land they're working. That means farmers like Bob Hawthorne hold a big piece to the future of farming. Mike Duffy describes the trend in Iowa.
In the early 80s, about 10%, 12% of the land was owned by people over 75.
Now, nearly a third of Iowa farmland belongs to people over 75. But those landowners know their neighbors are watching and waiting.
Where you see tensions is in communities, people trying to bid for land and outbid each other, and going to retirement homes and going to funerals and asking widows if, offering to rent their land, and, all kinds of nonsense like that. To some extent, it's competition among businesses, but to some extent, it's very cutthroat and it leaves bad feelings.
Bob Hawthorne does wonder what will happen to his family's farm. He knows one thing. After 4 generations, the Hawthorne family farm ends here. He has no children of his own. He never married. What will happen? It's a big question, and not one he seems ready to answer. Not just yet.
When I look overhead, I see a lot of vultures circling and descending on me. They can't wait until I retire, I die, or become physically or mentally incompetent on the farm, so they get their greedy hands on my farmland. Every farm wants to grab more land because it's not big enough. I've never heard of any farm that wants to sell some land because it's got too much.
Every farm family eventually has to answer the question, who's next? And how they answer that question has consequences for rural communities across the country, because fewer farms mean fewer people. Consider the changes since Bob Hawthorne started farming. In 1955, there were more than 4.5 million farms nationwide. But over the decades, new technology allowed fewer people to raise more food than ever before.
When you have a number of people that are working the land and earning a living off of the land, then they perform activities in the community, they buy groceries, et cetera, et cetera. And as you have fewer and fewer of them, then you don't need 2 grocery stores, and maybe you don't even need a grocery store.
By 2011, there were only about 2 million farms in the U.S. The percentage of Americans living in rural areas plummeted.
It used to be the measure of success was how many of your children you could get off the farm.
As farm communities try to hold on to what they have, they need more people to stay on the farm. With the improved farm economy, there are more opportunities for young people to stick around. 13 years ago, there was a young man who wanted to do just that. Mike Tobias catches up with him in Bladen, Nebraska.
Hang on a minute. What do we got in here?
It was the summer of 2000. Kelly and Riley Skurdlant had a lot on their minds. At this moment, whether a skunk was hiding inside irrigation pipe. But long term, they were both thinking about the future of the Skurdlant family farm.
Come on, Mischief!
Riley was 18, fresh out of high school with a passion for working with cattle and desire to do something different than most of his classmates. That's stay in agriculture.
A lot of people tell you if they could sit in an office and make money, they would, but I'd rather work from sun up to sundown for it and sweat it out.
Come on, girls!
Kelly, Riley's dad, wanted this to happen, just like he took over the farm from his father. But Kelly had concerns. Running a farm was getting expensive. Fuel, fertilizer, and equipment costs were going up.
I think you'd make a very good farmer. But it's tougher and tougher all the time for these young guys.
There was a lot of uncertainty for Riley and the Skurdlant farm. Flash forward 13 years. Riley is farming with his dad. After high school, he took community college classes and had a series of full-time jobs, all ag-related, most fairly close to home. Most recently, he was working with a fertilizer plant in Bladen. In one way or another, he also stayed involved with the farm, gradually starting to make more management decisions, especially involving livestock. The Skurdlant family farm became his full-time job at the beginning of 2013, taking a role he describes as primary operator and secondary manager.
Dad finally decided he was getting too old to do a lot of it and wanted to slow down just a little bit. So I think the last couple of years I've been planting a lot for him, and a lot of hours at night after I'd worked all day over there, I'd come home, plant half the night for him, and I think he could see it was kind of getting worn down on me and my family and everyone else. So I think it was time that we did something different.
Certainly having him back on the farm, really, literally back on the farm, is a big difference. And although we are at times in conflict about management, and probably not as much conflict as he thinks, but it's just amazing to have him here.
Kelly, in his early 60s, calls this an evolution of the Skurdlant farm, similar to the way he took over the operation from his father. It's a typical way farms change hands, and the typical way young people enter agriculture.
Without a parent or a child relationship, or a grandparent or an uncle or a neighbor or someone to help get going, it's really difficult to jump into this.
Geller's been helping young farmers get started for several decades, a time during which there's been a trend toward fewer young people entering agriculture. In 1982, 38% of principal farm operators had less than 10 years' experience. By 2007, that number was down to 26%. But Geller has a feeling that trend may be changing.
I have a hunch that we will see an increase, or at least a stabilizing of the younger people coming back in. I think a lot of it has to do with the economics of the whole situation, where especially in the crop side of things, profits have really returned to agriculture in a way that they haven't in the last 30 or 40 years.
I think in this area there are probably more younger guys Riley's age, in that 30 to 35 range, that are staying in ag.
That's just an amendment. It can be an amendment to the lease. You just add it on to what you have.
At a workshop for beginning farmers and ranchers, Angie Miller is talking about leasing pasture land. With rapidly rising ag land values, access to land is one of the big barriers for beginning farmers. Miller, an attorney who works with a beginning farmer program, says that's why it's important to have programs that help.
Nebraska is the first state to pioneer what's called the our beginning farmer tax credit, which allows for a beginning farmer to have a 3-year lease with an established producer generally. The established producer gets a 3-year tax credit. The beginning farmer gets a 3-year lease and a foot in a door.
When I started farming, the thing to do was you go out and buy some ground. You buy the land and maybe share some machinery for a while and maybe rent a quarter or two of ground to go with that. Today that buy the land thing looks like it's coming 5, 10, 15 years down the road before they're able to generate enough capital to come up with that down payment so they can cash flow that land purchase.
Land isn't an issue for Riley Skurdlin. The family has about 1,800 acres. That's large for a family farm in the United States. Here they grow corn, soybeans, and wheat and run about 150 head of cattle. Now the challenge is the transition, or evolution, as Kelly Skurdlin calls it.
I think it's the lack of communication that really is when we see transitions begin to fail.
Whether you're family, relation, or even if you aren't family related, you need to figure out a way to talk about a lot of things. Expectations in the generations tend to be quite a bit different.
Transitions can be formal or informal. The latter, common in family operations, would probably best describe how Riley and Kelly are doing business.
There's a lot of old ways of thinking and new ways of thinking kind of coming together that don't really like to agree a lot of times.
When you work together in this kind of an operation, I think you're going to have differences.
We're both not the best of communicators. It's going to be kind of fly by our seat of our pants, I think, really. It's probably the most wrong plan you could have in place, but that's kind of the way we're going to go with it, I think.
We probably both have a quick trigger, but things never last very long between us. It's done and over, and then we go on and get the job done. So that's probably not the way you would have someone write it out on a piece of paper for you to do this, but I think it's going to work for us.
For those without family ties, finding land is one of the biggest obstacles to starting a new farm. Besides that, imagine paying a couple $100,000 for a new tractor or $250 for one bag of seed. Not many people have the kind of money it takes to get a new farm off the ground, but Ryan Robertson met one couple who did it by thinking small.
Just outside of Columbia, Missouri, on Honey Creek Farms, Dan and Laura Pugh make their way through their field. It's harvest day on the farm. Today's bounty, fresh arugula, spinach, kale, and other assorted greens.
Right now I only have about a half acre in vegetables. We'll be expanding to this area up here and eventually those fields out there. So total, all at one time it'd be about 2 acres. So beyond that it gets pretty hard to manage in vegetable production. But you can do a lot in just an acre.
Dan and Laura are 2 years into their new careers as farmers. Self-proclaimed city kids, neither had any ties to farming growing up. But one day, Dan decided to go to a land auction. That's when the Pughs became landowners.
It was in a one family for the past 100 years.
The Pughs paid $2,300 an acre for their 50-acre farm, a steal in today's market. By traditional standards, it's a terrible place to farm. But the Pughs aren't traditional farmers. They're what many call alternative or sustainable farmers. While their primary focus is vegetable production, like most farmers, they're diversified. Dan quit selling medical supplies, but Laura still has a job in the city, working for a professor at the University of Missouri. For now, they're dependent on that off-farm income.
The first year, for paying for the building, all the equipment, the animals, everything that goes with it, there's a lot of upfront costs in those terms, you know. So, you know, it's just getting some money in, but it's going to be a few years before we're on the flip side of it, where we're, you know, breaking even, making money on things. So,
even though small farmers aren't making large profits, the USDA says the greatest increase in farm numbers is for small farms, with annual sales less than $10,000 a year.
Farmers are older, but what about farm workers?
At the University of Missouri, Dr. Mary Hendrickson teaches the next generation of American farmers. She says it's no coincidence more small farms are popping up, given the historically high land prices.
A they seem to be quite high right now, and that makes it's difficult for beginning farmers to afford land. We know that for a lot of our farmers who are trying to do direct marketing and things like that, they often run into problems around cities, right? Because land is more expensive for development and things like that.
Hendrickson says not only will many of the farms in the future be smaller operations, they will also have more diverse operators, including immigrants and women like Laura Pugh.
It is possible, and a million people will tell you it's not possible, that you're crazy and stupid and all of that, but it is possible.
It's that kind of optimism which has kept American farmers on the land and bringing their products to market. And now as land ownership changes hands, the middle is disappearing, leaving larger farms and small startups, both hoping to meet the needs of a hungry world.
Even a small amount of land can turn out to be a big opportunity. Land is a farmer's legacy and a farmer's livelihood. One reason more farmers are working long past the age when others might retire is that their golden years turned out to be boom years.
And often they're the only people that have enough money that they can keep doing it and can keep buying the land that comes up for sale.
Land also becomes part of a farmer's identity. They find it hard to give up, even when they know others are eager to get started.
Eventually, someone has to farm that land, and eventually someone has to take over that operation. It's something you have to decide if you want it to continue as a business, you want to have it continue as a family operation.
We aren't short of young people that want to farm. We're short of old people that want to move over.
Land is hard to get your hands on, especially for new farmers. For good land, demand is high, supplies are short, and prices are steep. So farms are likely to grow bigger or stay small, while farms in the middle lose ground.
And they may be the 5,000 acre cash grain operation, or even 15,000 acre multifamily operation, or they could be the 5 acre specialty crop producer that has found a commercial niche.
Land is the first thing a farmer needs and the last thing they want to give up. But more farms and families are reaching a time of change, a time when the people who own the land now must decide who will own the land next.
It's still just dirt, but there's something about it that when it's been there that long, it's kind of a piece of you then.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.